I'll be sort of brief and focus on the facts. So I'm going to be talking about climate action in a post-COVID world based on three pieces of evidence. The first is the report that we produced in 2018. This is the famous IPCC 1.5 C report, which I was a co-author of and helped sort of lead the process on implementation. That's the underlying evidence. There's a summary for urban policymakers that we were very happy to work with a whole range of other colleagues, especially colleagues from ICLEI and other major networks, which basically took the science from the 1.5 report and made it accessible to urban policymakers because they were part of the process. And finally, an article that's just come out. If you go to the UN Chronicle and you're on the web, you can see that it's on the masthead at the moment. It's an article where I argue that we need to harness urbanization to accelerate SDG implementation in a post-COVID world, which will, of course, involve dealing with the challenges of climate. So what are the key findings from the special report on 1.5 C? The obvious things, we know that the world is already warm by 1 degree C above pre-industrial levels. We're warming at the current point of time at about 0.2 C degrees per decade, which basically means that we will reach 1.5 C by the late 2030s, or maybe even earlier if the current trends proceed. So basically limiting warming to 1.5 C, which is in a sense what the Paris Climate Agreement left us with as an aspiration, depends on significant reduction in greenhouse gases. You know, we talk about it in terms of 50% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. But the real issue for us, especially many of us from developing countries and in cities, is looking at the potential climate impacts. So at 1.5 C, our estimates are about 500 million people will be water stressed. At 2 degrees C, if we sort of overtake that 1.5 C target, we'd probably mean getting to about 600 million people being affected. Already at 1.5 C, we know that about 350 million people will be exposed to deadly heat waves in megacities. And I guess a very important question for the survival of cities is that at 1.5 C, food crop productions would affect only about maybe 30, 40 million people, but at 2 C, we can expect to see something like almost 400 million people being affected. And this is very important in terms of food security for urban systems that don't necessarily produce food. So what can we do to get onto 1.5 pathway to limit warming? The critical thing here is that it will involve 4 significant but simultaneous system transitions. The energy one, which most people understand, the industrial one, which is more difficult to deal with, the land and ecosystem transition that we often forget, but that's essential to both urban areas and the areas around them. But critically, the urban and infrastructure system transition, which we've spent so much time trying to get a sense of. So we did a very systematic piece of work looking at almost 1,500 different sources of references on this to try and understand whether the urban and infrastructure transition is actually feasible. Around 6 different dimensions, you can see them on that slide. And what did we find? We found from the literature as we know it today, and this may change in the future, is there about 8 critical urban mitigation options, and those of you who are mayors, those of you who are working on the ground on this question would recognize them. Solar PV and wind with battery storage, electric vehicles, better public transport, low energy buildings, energy efficiency, ecosystem restoration and sustainable land use, of course, urban planning, but also softer things like reducing food wastage and bioenergy. This is a suite of things that we know actually work and can take these processes to scale as far as mitigation is concerned. But cities in many parts of the world, especially in the developing world, those that are most vulnerable, have major issues on adaptation. And there also we know that there are a whole set of options that can take these processes to scale. Green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, community-based adaptation, which is very important in bottom-up processes. And ICLEI has been leading on this for many, many years. Appropriate building codes and standards. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, when you're looking at food security and ecosystem services security, efficient irrigation and conservation agriculture are also important part of those processes. But I guess the core challenge is not only the question of finding these options, it is what enables them to come together and be delivered. And I guess there are half dozen odd things that we know that works. The most important one is effective multi-level governance. And within that, the centrality of local and regional government to facilitate community-centric responses. of course, and like we've heard today, strong political leadership is central because that's all these three things enable us to get better access to finance, technology, and innovation, which will hopefully make these transitions possible. Of course, on the demand side, one very important thing that we often forget to talk about is improved climate education and greater public awareness, because if we do not accelerate behavior change, and I think, COVID has been a very interesting example for us in this space, because it's actually taught us that dramatic behavior change at the global scale can actually be possible. Now, whether we can do that in the climate space or not is a question that we have to look at. Of course, then deployment of general purpose technologies like ICT and IoT, etc., but also very important, well-functioning legal framework. So these are the essential enabling conditions to enable the urban transition. But I guess probably the most critical one of them is, can we pay for this? Do we have the resources? Now, unfortunately, Paris only committed to 100 billion. But our estimates from the IPCC is just the energy system transition will need an annual average investment of about 2.5 trillion over the next 20 years or so. Now, this seems like a huge amount of money, but looking at the scale of the global economy, looking at the value addition that cities make, it's actually not a huge amount of resources. Cities on their own, are adding a much more significant amount to the global economy at the current point in time. So the bottom line, I guess, is that financing of 1.5 C is beyond the fiscal capacity of most cities and most countries. So we do need a reimagination of global and local financial frameworks. So finally, what can we learn from these three pieces of evidence that I've shown you? The first and most important thing is that we need rapid, deep, and systemic changes to address climate risk and future pandemics, because COVID, in some senses, has reset the baseline. These changes, unfortunately, unlike when we started in Rio many years ago, or even at Rio plus 20, all of these changes have to be implemented simultaneously. And there's limited space for trade-off between them, which is exactly the reason why local and regional governments are so important in this, because they know how to deal with these questions simultaneously, because that's what mayors, that's what local government do. You need cross-scalar partnerships between local, regional, and national government and local actors. This is a tough one, and I think we're going to have to learn a lot on trying to build these partnerships over the next few decades. To make this possible, you need adequately empowered local governments to enable not only the vertical integration, but the horizontal cross-sectoral integration, which will give us all of these outcomes together. And to make this happen, you have to build the capacity of local governments to act territorially, not only deal with what's happening in the city, but deal with water and food and a whole range of other issues and inequality, which actually work territorially. To make this happen, this is the hard and most difficult political question. We have to deepen the mandate, institutional capacity, and financial resources of local government. And I think this is the big struggle that we've been engaged with. So I think it's not only important to have bold cities, it's very critical to also have bold national governments and very supportive international arrangements to make this possible. And then, as far as the international system is concerned, we do absolutely need to establish appropriate governance systems, not only of the global commons, that's what the UNFCCC and the climate and other sort of agreements are about, but also the global financial system, because at the moment, it is a serious challenge to making this happen. And we do need to make the shifts because the amount of resources that we need are very significant. So if we do all of these things together, the outcome, of course, is that national governments and international institutions would have the space and the resources to focus on multiple elements of the unfinished SDG agenda, especially because there's been a massive setback in many parts of the world, including my country, because of the COVID pandemic. So in some senses, there seems to be an imperative that COVID has handed us to actually build these partnerships and make sure that we not only make these four system transitions simultaneously, but give local and regional governments a centrality, agency, and power to make these processes happen. So thank you very much, Eunice.